Dr. Eric Mitchell is a certified school psychologist and a licensed psychologist in Pennsylvania. He is active in multiple neurodiversity initiatives around the region. His other accomplishments include being a published author, an educator, an evaluator, program developer, a researcher, and a facility director. He is also a clinician, a consultant, a father, and a family member, and an advocate in the autism community. And with that, Dr. Mitchell, you can take over.
Sure. Thank you very much, Lakin. I appreciate that. And welcome, everybody. Usually at this point in time, if we weren't in kind of COVID times, I'd have everybody raise hands and kind of identify, like, kind of where they're coming from as far as their own kind of kind of brief bio as well, and kind of what you would like to get out of tonight. At this point, being COVID times, we have this wonderful thing called a chat box. So if there are specific questions, I think what we decided was we were going to, ask folks to put questions or comments into the chat box, and then Lakin and her colleagues can help facilitate that and kind of give me a shout out. I'm happy to be interrupted at any time, so don't be bashful. If there's things that I can, be helpful with, we don't have to wait until the end of the session. We will be breaking, I think about 15 minutes before 8 p.m.-ish for questions as needed. Or as folks would like. So maybe leave a little bit more time than that, but we'll see how it goes. So tonight, I'm going to go ahead and start the screen share with the PowerPoint, everybody's favorite app, I'm sure, for webinars. So I'm going to skip right over. Let's see if I can get rid of this so I can actually see what I'm talking about. There we go. And that doesn't go away very well. I'll minimize that. Okay. So yeah, as far as where we are tonight, hoping that folks will be able to get something from the session that matches up to what your needs are. But I know everyone is different. As the old saying goes, if you met one person with autism, you met one person with autism, or one autistic person, if you will, to use some kind of culturally kind of inclusive language. So we're going to jump right in. Part of what we're going to do is kind of go over some of the the basics, and then we'll kind of branch over into some of the more detailed information. So just to go through the boring stuff, if you guys aren't aware, the diagnosis of autism started to be the autism as a condition, if you will, or as a difference, if you will, started to be described by a couple folks all the way back in the 1940s, but it's always been around in history. So this is nothing new. It just started making its way into the literature in the 1940s. Leo Kanner and Hans Asperger were two doctors who separately, separated from World War II and various things, were describing different folks on different places on the autism spectrum. So Leo Kanner describing folks who would now be kind of more lined up with what we call level 3 ASD, which I'll talk about in a moment. Hans Asperger describing folks who would be kind of more what we call level 1 ASD. So to meet criteria currently under the DSM-5, and that's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that we use in this country, that there are basically two big buckets of symptoms. One is the social communication domain, which hopefully you can see my little arrow here. So social communication and social interaction. There are usually some persistent deficits that are in these particular three areas. So that's kind of the one bucket, the social communication piece. And the other bucket of symptoms, you need to check off at least two of the four down here, and those are restricted patterns of behavior, interests, and so on. All those symptoms have to be present, or at least the identifying symptoms have to be present in early childhood. So somewhere between 2, 3, those symptoms start popping up more persistently. Sometimes you can see them a little bit earlier, but they should be there somewhere in early childhood. There are some of these symptoms that may pop up with other kinds of conditions. There are folks that may present as being neurodiverse without necessarily being identified as on the autism spectrum. So, there is, we see this as more of a lifelong kind of profile that is, kind of linked to some, pre-existing genetic factors, but also, we have the reality of the world that kind of plays in there as well. So the nature nurture question, usually there's a little bit of both going on, but it at least needs to have those precursors of those, neurological differences, not necessarily deficits, but differences that are coming into play. And those symptoms to be diagnosed have to be impairing daily functioning. So it can't just be that, we have symptoms, but we're successful because of them. You can identify as neurodiverse and recognize that you are, have an autism profile. But to be diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, that's where we have to meet these criteria, and they have to be impairing our daily functioning. A lot of folks will ask, well, why isn't Asperger's in there anymore? In 2013, the DSM, which was DSM-4 at the time, when it was updated to 5, took out Asperger's and folded it under the ASD, or the autism spectrum disorder umbrella. It is still recognized in a lot of international circles and even colloquially here in the United States, but it's no longer its own separate diagnosis. It's more of an identification that people may have as being Aspergian or Aspie. It's more of a way that people are starting to identify and to feel a sense of solidarity with each other, as opposed to being a distinct diagnosis. Also in DSM-5 as of 2013, PDD, NOS, Rett's, and childhood disorder disorder were essentially taken out of the DSM, kind of folded under this autism spectrum disorder. So for folks who are a little, diagnosed prior to 2013, you may still see some, some old reports. Maybe some of your adult children, maybe carrying some of those old diagnoses, and that would currently be folded under the autism spectrum disorder umbrella, if you will, with some exceptions. I just wanted to kind of play a little bit of a video that doesn't have to do with these particular buckets of symptoms, but is often, kind of considered the additional kind of bucket of symptoms that isn't in the DSM-5, and that is the sensory differences. For many people on the autism spectrum, the majority of the folks on the autism spectrum, there's some differences in the way that we experience the world. And that is in, the sensory systems can be oversensitized or undersensitized in a variety or any combination of the different senses. And that makes things sometimes pretty challenging to navigate through the world. So yes, we have the social communication piece, we have the repetitive patterns of behavior piece and the restrictive patterns of behavior, but we also have this sensory piece. So I just want to kind of play this. I think some folks have probably already seen this video, but it gives a nice introduction to kind of experience the world through the eyes of someone who does have some, kind of sensory differences. Here we go.
Six, 7, 8, 9.
Take my hand.
No, Alex. It's fine, isn't it? I'm not naughty. I'm autistic. And I just get too much information.
Okay, so again, this is not representative of everyone on the spectrum, but certainly the majority of folks have some differences that they experience, whether it's whether it's visual, whether it's auditory, whether there's taste differences, sensitivity to light. All of these things can start to become affected and create an experience of the world that can be overwhelming. We talk about the term trauma sometimes, and trauma usually refers to experiencing the world in a way that, or a particular experience, an event-based experience that that kind of alters one's life and alters one's perception and emotional and physical and mental stability. And when we're talking about living on the spectrum with sensory differences, especially, in addition to obviously the social communication and the repetitive patterns of behavior, sometimes the world can be a place of trauma with a, quote, small t. That trauma can be exacerbated over time. And when that happens, some of the same symptoms of trauma with a big T can start to feel, pretty intrusive. I'm not suggesting that everyone on the spectrum feels trauma or should be diagnosed with PTSD or something like that, but the complex nature, the incremental kind of intrusions into your psyche from experiencing the world in a way that is not very kind and embracing can be overwhelming for a lot of folks and create some long-term difficulties as time goes on. These are the three levels that under the DSM, as far as diagnostic purposes are concerned. Level 1, requiring support. Level 2, requiring substantial support. Level 3, requiring very substantial support. In some ways, these labels are a little bit deceptive. Most people say that, okay, well, level 1 has to be the Asperger's diagnosis, the old high-functioning autism label, if you will, the HFA for short. And sometimes that is the case. Sometimes you just need a little bit of support or just requiring support with deficits not overwhelming on a daily basis. But sometimes a little bit of autism can affect you in profound ways in certain circumstances. So depending on how that plays out, a person who's diagnosed level 1 may require support. Maybe they require very substantial support. We have to take that individual's own kind of experience of the world into consideration. Reciprocally, someone with level 3, quote, requiring very substantial support, sometimes in a certain kind of environment, they function incredibly well and the quality of life is very high. So we have to keep that in mind as well, that somebody who is level 3, they may need high levels of support in one situation or at one developmental period of their lives, usually on the earlier side, if you can get the early intervention going pretty well. Whereas later on in their life, they may be very happy sustaining a life that is kind of life in their own comfort zone, or life in the box, if you will. So if things are lined up in a way that they're comfortable with and they're functioning, then they're good to go. So that's something just to kind of keep in mind. Views of ASD over time. We have this old school thought of back in the day, as it were, that people who were presenting as autistic, prior to Kanner and Asperger, were either possessed by demons or requiring exorcism. There's passages in not biblical, but religious kind of motifs and paintings and texts that describe people that needed this kind of exorcism. We come to understand that in some cultures as almost being somebody who is maybe even closer to God. Maybe they don't require exorcism. Maybe they're touched by God in a way that can see things from a different perspective. So kind of both ends of the gamut in that respect. We start to get into the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, and now we start to get into more modern times, where we start to talk about diagnoses of the original infantile autism or infantile schizophrenia caused by mothers. And there was a lot of damage done by the field not understanding and even taking false research Bruno Bettelheim and others, that described the mothers of autistic kids as being cold and aloof, not loving their children enough, not giving them enough attention, so that essentially they developed autism because their mothers didn't do a good job. And the guilt that that caused, was pretty profound. Obviously, being told you're a refrigerator mother or what have you, it doesn't sit well. The idea was that autism required institutionalization, and that through the 1960s and 70s, people were just kind of thrown in institutions, and that's where they sat. Follow that through with the vaccine kind of scare. Then we're into the 1990s, where we have other people presenting false information out there that said, okay, well, vaccines cause autism, and then the next week we hear, okay, that's falsified research, and the Lancet published an article that was based on false information, and so now we start to blame other factors. We have the Autism Genome Project that starts to make sense of autism, but attributes that to a predominantly genetic pattern, but that's only a partial understanding. We know that it's a very complex set of genomes that can happen more or less frequently, and makes everyone different. It's not a one on and off chromosome. We have ransom campaigns, ransom notes published in, I think it was USA Today, back in the early 2000s, that scare the public into saying, okay, autism has stolen your child and is not going to give them back, and raise a lot of money and a lot of awareness around autism, but didn't really help the idea of autism being a spectrum, autism being what we now start to understand is more of a difference than a quote disorder. Yes, there are folks that absolutely need all of our support and intensive services, but this is also part of a different pattern of neurology that presents as neurodiverse, neurodivergent, neuroatypical, those words meaning generally the same thing, associated with the previous kind of medical terminology of autism spectrum disorder, autism itself, kind of morphing over into more of an identity kind of a transformation, where we start to identify as Aspies, Audis, NDs, so on and so forth, to say there's pride in this community, there's support in this community. So whereas we once had, Autism Awareness month of April, and Autism Awareness Day, I think it was April 2nd, that started to shift. So advocacy organizations in the really the last 10 years have been talking more about autism acceptance, as being, that we accept autism. We're already aware of autism. Now it's our job to accept autism for what it is, and to accept people on the spectrum into our communities. We're no longer wanting to institutionalize everyone just because they have a diagnosis. That there are many folks that are essential people that are in our society that need to be appreciated, and that's where we start to get into autism appreciation. So we haven't gotten to the point where I think we can truly say that we are moving from awareness into acceptance through to appreciation, but I think we're getting closer. I'm going to skip the video on from the Temple Grandin diagnosis, just in the interest of time. We take a look at where some of ASD is in the classic literature, and this is more of a comment on where we are educationally with autism. If folks are familiar with the Dr. Seuss novel Gerald McBoing Boing, which is actually was the 1950 winner for the Academy Award for a movie short, you can find it on YouTube. This is a story about Gerald McCloy, who couldn't say words. He said, boing boing instead. So this is before the idea of IDEA and the need to support people. What happened to this particular boy was, he went to school, he couldn't, speak. He said boing boing instead. Pretty much a kid on the spectrum, as we start to understand now. Dr. Seuss didn't really know that at the time, but that's the kid he was describing, and he was sent home. The school said, we cannot accept him, for we have a rule that pupils must not go cuckoo in our school. Your boy will go honk all his life, I'm afraid. Sincerely yours, Finney Schultz, teacher, first grade. So essentially, there was a time, it's hard to imagine, before IDEA and ADA for the adults to, the Americans with Disabilities Act that protects adults. There was a time before these laws that people could just say, no, I'm not going to deal with folks on the spectrum. We're just going to throw them kind of back to the families and just be done with it. What we started to realize over time was that people, and I think Dr. Seuss was, very astute in his observation that, it is not just about throwing away folks with a disability because they have a disability. It's about finding what the abilities are and maximizing those abilities to the greatest extent possible. If a kid can't speak, what can they do? Well, this is an example of Jerome McCloy, who, started to, do voiceovers. He could make all these amazing sounds. And so then, essentially, radio picks him up, the equivalent of modern TV or video games, maximizes his strengths, and he becomes a world famous, voiceover actor. So, if we trace that into modern times, we say, well, where are the safe havens? We'll be talking about that in a little while, that folks on the spectrum can gravitate toward, that they can walk themselves into or be walked into and be appreciated for their strengths, their abilities, not their disabilities. So this is the match that we're trying to figure out. I'll be shifting into adult mode pretty soon, but I just wanted to mention many folks, ask me, fairly often, when is it safe for the right time to tell my kid that they have autism? That they are autistic, or that they can identify as neurodiverse. And to some extent, the answer is as soon as they're ready. The earlier, the better. The walking through adolescence, knowing that you're different and not knowing why, is difficult for any adolescent. Sometimes with some folks that are more profoundly affected by ASD, the world is very small, and their zone of proximal development, if to quote Vygotsky, is fairly narrow. It's close in to them, so they may be protected in some ways inside that autism bubble. For other kids, that's not quite the case. That they are profoundly affected. They desperately want to connect. They want to be successful, just like any other kid. And yet they know that there's something that's not quite clicking. They know that there's a difference, but they can't put their finger on it. So the earlier, the better. As we start to go through the teenage years, especially, we start to encounter, differences. We start to encounter bullying. Maybe even before teenage years, we encounter these things. And this is where we immerse ourselves and try to learn about ourselves. In classic identity theory, we immerse ourselves in how we are different. We need answers at that time. We need to understand what being on the spectrum is about in a positive, strengths-based manner. And eventually the idea is, if we immerse ourselves, we start to identify positively, then we're able to come out of that and with a better sense of identity. We emerge from that with autonomy. We feel strong about ourselves. We feel strongly about our community, our autism community, our neurodiverse community. And hopefully that kicks in before some other difficulties, take over. If we don't have the proper information going in, if we don't have the strengths-based orientation going in, kids start to hear the messages, or teenagers hear the messages that, they're not liked, or they're behaving strangely, or they're weird, or they're, different, and that's damaging. Just because they're acting different doesn't mean that they're acting with a deficit. Sometimes there may be a deficit. Sometimes it's just that they're different, and maybe even more in tune with a certain thing than their peers. They need to understand those strengths in context, because they may not be able to put those pieces together themselves. So this is just a quote that actually my son made. He asked, this is a conversation he was having with Siri. He said, "Siri, are you autistic?" This is several years ago. And Siri, I love the programmers at Apple, by the way. Back at that time, I think they changed the answer to this since then, but Siri says, "I can't answer that." And my son says, "Why not?" And Siri says, "I don't know. Frankly, I've wondered that myself." And so, normalizing that conversation, giving folks the opportunity at a young age, he was 11 at the time, that creates a safe haven for them. We have, ways of kind of putting out positive messages, putting out, distinct autism heroes, if you will, rather than, kind of negative perspectives of autism. Identifying that there are safe places that they can be themselves, whether it's at home, whether it's in their, whether it's in, some kind of a social skills group or a extracurricular that tends to attract neurodiverse kids. There are ways that we can build those bridges to allow them a better sense of the world. So is ASD a disorder, a syndrome, a condition, a deficiency, or a difference? I would submit the latter. But again, that doesn't mean that there aren't all of those things happening simultaneously. Yes, there are differences. Yes, there can be deficiencies. Yes, it is a condition, it is a syndrome, it is a disorder. It's all these things, but we have to be able to take a strengths-based perspective on it, and that changes over time. The old, phrases of racism, sexism, autism. Is this another ism that we need to address? Is autism itself being turned into a word that is used against people rather than to identify and to bring solidarity? Is it something that is kind of used as almost a lightning rod that can be damaging for kids as they're starting to develop? So I'm going to skip the model of cultural competence for now. So again, looking into how we are strong, powerful people. This is an NPR interview with Sophie and Ben. I'm just going to kind of put this out there as this is cannot play media file. I wonder what happens if, oh, there it is. Okay, here we go.
I have Asperger's syndrome, a higher degree of autism, and what separates me is, well, it's an entire spectrum, so I guess increased intellectual capabilities, decreased social abilities, and as you know, with autism comes obsessions. And I am basically just a super nerd.
So I'm just going to play that bit of it because I know we don't want to go through the entire piece tonight, but the idea that, that armed with that knowledge about oneself, we can start to identify that it's okay to be a nerd. It's okay to be a geek. It's okay to be neither. It's okay to love sports and know every statistic about sports or not. That this strengths-based orientation, brings us into opportunities for a new world, whether we're, quote, fighting for autism or whether we're appearing on Jeopardy in this kind of little humorous clip that I'm going to play
now. Football 200.
Your choice. Do or don't name this play in which the quarterback runs the ball and can choose to pitch it to another back.
It's
an option play. Ryan?
Football 400.
I can tell you guys are big football fans.
Yeah.
Tom Landry perfected the shotgun formation with this team. Dallas Cowboys. Do you think we should go to commercial? Ryan?
Take it on to 600.
Okay, by signaling for one of these, a returner can reel in a kick without fear of getting tackled. Fair catch. 2 clues left, Ryan.
800.
These penalties are simultaneous violations by the offense and defense that cancel each other out. And they are called offsetting penalties. Let's look at the $1,000 clue just for the fun of it. Jimmy?
As Minneapolis's U.S. Bank Stadium prepares to host Super Bowl 52, I'm looking at the Ring of Honor with names from this defensive line that took the Vikings to 4 Super Bowls.
If you guys ring in and get this one, I will die. Who are the purple people eaters? We're going to take a break. I have to talk to them.
Lots of fun. So again, finding ways to kind of celebrate, with a bit of, self-deprecating humor, very helpful. I like this kind of alternate way to look at it. It's not about being neurodiverse necessarily that's the problem in some situations. Sometimes it's being neurotypical that's the problem. This is just kind of a humorous little take on that. Somebody kind of flipped the diagnosis. Instead of neurodiverse or autism, they call it neurotypical syndrome. The rest of us who are not diagnosed in the spectrum. So, going down here, NTs find it difficult to communicate directly, have a much higher incidence of lying as compared to persons on the autistic spectrum. NT is believed to be genetic in origin. Autopsies have shown that the brain of a neurotypical is typically smaller than that of an autistic individual and may have overdeveloped areas related to social behavior. Tragically, as many as plus 9,000 of 10,000 individuals may be neurotypical, and there is no known cure for neurotypical syndrome. I love the reframe on that. So sometimes it's the rest of us who need to make the changes, not necessarily the folks that are affected by being different. Being more inclusive and understanding is really our responsibility. So I'll actually, let's see, I'm going to skip over some of these as well. Actually, let me play Faith's identity. So this is from the sibling perspective, which I think is very important as well.
Now, I cannot deny that there have been some challenging moments in my family, moments where I've wished that they were just like me. But I cast my mind back to the things that they've taught me about individuality and communication and love. And I realized that these are things that I wouldn't want to change with normality. Normality overlooks the beauty that differences give us. And the fact that we are different doesn't mean that one of us is wrong. It just means that there's a different kind of right. And if I could communicate just one thing to Remy and to Sam,
Her brothers,
and to you, it would be that you don't have to be normal. You can be extraordinary. Because autistic or not, the differences that we have, we've got a gift. Everyone's got a gift inside of us. And in all honesty, the pursuit of normality is the ultimate sacrifice of potential. The chance for greatness, for progress, and for change dies the moment we try to be like someone else. Please, don't tell me I'm normal. Thank you.
very cool. So I'm just going to also read a quote by a client of mine, actually. He was 10 years old at the time. He says, "My experience is that I've been through things in my life. I went through changing 3 schools, and that was hard. I sat through misleadingly depressing things, and that caused anxiety like a horrible hospital I went to. I am also an autistic, which means that my brain works differently. In a place full of people who are neurotypical, people with regular brain waves, it is like being in a different country, but the world is the country. So if you were to go to China blindly, you would have no idea what to do. Same with me, but the world is China. And me and around 1 million other people have to deal with that. Another part of being autistic is that no other autistic person will have all the same symptoms. We will always have at least 1 or 2 different symptoms. So I always know that no one will go through practically the same things, which makes me feel alone." Well, I like to say we aren't alone. We are a growing community, for better or for worse. Sometimes that's difficult to accept. Sometimes that's easy to accept. But we aren't alone. We are growing, and we need to find each other out there. So what is it about autism that that's changing over time? I think we talked about the perspective of autism, but a lot of people ask me, why are the rates continuing to explode? Why are we looking at more and more autism in the community? Why is it that that everywhere we turn, there's somebody in the family or somebody that's a friend or whoever it may be that's starting to be identified on the spectrum? And this is just an illustration. This is not on hard numbers at all. But if you were to take a look at the percentage of bronze versus brain of how to be successful in society, take a look at hunter-gatherer society. An argument could be made that you need to have more strength than intelligence, more brawn than brain in order to be successful, in order to survive. We're talking about survival of the species here. In the agricultural age, you need to have a little bit more brains because now you need to know when to plant crops and when to harvest and so on. But there's still a lot of hard work, physical labor that needs to occur. Start to move into the industrial age. Now you need to know how to design things and to build things. And yes, you need some brawn to do that, but it's really about, kind of more, kind of intellect and so on. In the information age, I mean, it's nice to have brawn, but you can sit behind a computer, and at a desk like I'm right now and make a very good living. So it's the information age that allows you to expand, to perpetuate the nature of the brain, to be the dominant factor in survival of the species and in the quality of life. Where are we going to in the future? Who knows? Who knows? But what we do know is that nature finds a way. And experimenting with the types of neurology that allows us to be successful is part of that process. Here's a cute little clip from the Big Bang Theory, if folks haven't seen it, to illustrate the point.
Oh no.
What?
That's Penny's ex-boyfriend.
What do you suppose he's doing here, besides disrupting the local gravity field?
If he were any bigger, he'd have moons orbiting him.
Oh, snap. So I guess we'll be leaving now.
Why should we leave? For all we know, he crashed the party and Penny doesn't even want him here.
You have a backup hypothesis?
Maybe they just want to be friends.
Or maybe she wants to be friends and he wants something more.
Then he and I are on equal ground.
Yes, but you're much closer to it than he is.
Look, if this was 15,000 years ago, by virtue of his size and strength, Kurt would be entitled to his choice of female partners.
And male partners, animal partners, large primordial eggplants, pretty much whatever tickled his fancy.
Yes, but our society has undergone a paradigm shift. In the information age, Sheldon, you and I are the alpha males. We shouldn't have to back down.
True. Why don't you text him that and see if he backs down?
No. I'm going to assert my dominance face to face.
Face to face? Are you going to wait for him to sit down, or are you going to stand on the coffee table?
So, spoiler alert for folks who haven't seen it. Leonard goes and kind of challenges, the big brawny boyfriend to a intellectual kind of discussion, and ends up getting thrown across the room. And Penny, of course, comes to his rescue, and they end up kind of kicking off their relationship from there. So again, not that this happens all the time in real life, but we are, again, as Leonard says, undergoing a paradigm shift. So as far as folks who, again, I'm just going to stream through these because I know we're not going to make it through all the slides otherwise. But identity development also relates to finding our role models, whether it's Susan Boyle, who came to fame in Britain's Got Talent, whether it's self-advocates like Jim Sinclair, whether it's folks like Carrie Magro, who took Jim Sinclair's place, not took his place, but served in the same capacity on the Autism Speaks Board of Directors to represent people on the autism spectrum. Nothing about us without us, as the saying goes. These are folks who can be role models for us as we're going through life. Not only people like the Temple Grandins, who are very accomplished writers, and the Bill Gates and Albert Einsteins and Nikola Tesla and so on, all the historical figures, but real life figures that are in our community. Everywhere we look, those are where we need to find our strength. Folks like Ari Naaman, who is the co-founder with Scott Robertson of Autism Self-Advocacy Network, talking about the autistic brothers and sisters who in many ways are needing our support. Not everyone is a super smart kind of computer engineer in our community, in our autism community. There are folks that need a lot more support, and we need to look out for all folks in the spectrum, not just those who are, represented in Big Bang Theory, or those that are represented in Silicon Valley or what have you. We need to be able to reach across that aisle. I'm going to play a quick clip from Rosie King to illustrate some of that point, at least.
about it. What is normal? What does it mean? Imagine if that was the best compliment you ever received. Wow, you are really normal. Compliments are, you are extraordinary, or you step outside the box, you're amazing. So if people want to be these things, why are so many people striving to be normal? Why are people pouring their brilliant individual light into a mold? People are so afraid of variety that they try and force everyone, even the people who don't want to or can't, to become normal. There are like camps for LGBTQ people or autistic people to try and make them this normal. And that's terrifying that people would do that in this day and age. All in all, I won't trade my autism and my imagination for the world. Because I am autistic, I've presented documentaries for the BBC, I'm in the midst of writing a book, I'm doing this is fantastic. And one of the best things that I've achieved, that I consider to have achieved, is I've found ways of communicating with my little brother and sister, who, as I've said, are non-verbal, they can't speak. And people would often write off someone who's non-verbal, but that's silly because my little brother and sister are the best siblings that you could ever hope for. They're just the best, and I love them so much, and I care about them more than anything else. I'm going to leave you with one question. If we can't get inside the person's mind, no matter if they're autistic or not, instead of punishing anything that strives from normal, why not celebrate uniqueness and cheer every time someone unleashes their imagination? Thank you.
Okay, go Rosie. So we're talking about the entire spectrum, not just folks who have that ability. Celebrating folks like Amanda Baggs, and I'm unfortunately not going to have time to play the entire clip, who is nonverbal, but has historically a very strong self-advocacy presence on the internet. Folks like Harley Fleischman, who is had her own show on YouTube, is an avid blogger, but again uses technology to help her communicate. Facilitated panels on technology with John Kerry and so on. These are the folks that kind of drive that conversation about, it's not just the flashy kind of whiz kid that that is represented or needs to be represented on the autism spectrum. It's the entire spectrum. So here's Carly. Oops.
How can we get more businesses to hire people with autism? Especially since a lot of people with autism are capable of working.
She's a bottom line girl. What do you say? I think Bob Bright answered the question earlier, and so did you. Sorry. Awareness. People have to become aware. There's an instant prejudice, if you will, that people have. Oh my gosh, I don't know if somebody who's autistic can do this or that. And the answer is, across the spectrum of autism, there are enormous capabilities, and they vary. There are all kinds of different levels of indicator across the spectrum. So the bottom line is awareness.
Go Carly. So again, it behooves us, all of us, to be able to find ways that we can, think about this globally, but yes, act locally. And building virtual ramps in the community is a way that we do that. Folks like moms like Krista Jakowski, who one day was kind of sick of going through the checkout line at the store and being her daughter kind of breaking down with all the candy around and not knowing how to express that we can't grab all the candy bars and try to tantrum about it. So she said to the manager of the store, "Can you just swap out some one aisle to make it a sensory friendly checkout?" And the store manager said, "Yeah, I can do that." Put up a little sign, sensory checkout, and instead of having candy bars at the checkout, they had little squeeze toys or kind of fidgets, and they had Play-Doh, and they had various kind of little doodads and things that are enjoyable and enriching for our kids in the spectrum. And lo and behold, became the most popular checkout line in the store, and drove their sales. So being inclusive isn't just about sacrificing. Being inclusive is about finding win-wins in our community. Dr. Wendy Ross here in Philadelphia through Autism Inclusion Resources, nominated as a senior hero a few years back, and here she is right there. Understanding that we need to train our entire community to be responsive. Going to all of the the Smithsonian's, going to airports, getting airlines to donate a plane for an hour and a flight crew so that we could take families on and get them used to get the kids used to going through security and onto a plane, and without actually having to take off, just getting kind of systematically desensitized into that experience. Training folks down at the parks in South Philadelphia, the Eagles and the Flyers and the Phillies and Sixers staffs, to be able to recognize when somebody is coming in with an autistic child or an autistic family member, and to be able to guide them to additional resources, to provide them with sensory objects, to give them some headphones that they can shield their ears from if it gets too loud in there. These are the kind of virtual ramps that we need to be thinking about. People like Saber Townsend and of course her son Brandon, who have led that charge. I won't go through the clips here necessarily, but these are the pieces that we need to think about. Transition planning. The next piece of transition planning is not necessarily a one-time thing. This is something that happens incrementally throughout the course of adulthood. Finding those safe havens is not a one and done. Just because we have a job doesn't mean we're keeping the job. Just because we have a place to live doesn't mean that we're not going to have difficulties with our roommates. Just because we have a little bit of money in the bank doesn't mean it's going to last us for the next, X number of X number of decades. Transition planning happens across the lifespan. It starts, legally speaking, at 14 years of age, with an IEP team. If it's identified, if the child is identified or the teenager is identified as needing an IEP, and it involves all of these systems, kind of meandering all through the course of lifetime. Here's a clip from one of our folks that we work with, who's been kind enough to lend his name and his story to us. This is a video that he put together describing who he is and what he's trying to do to transition into adulthood.
I'm a student enrolled at MCCC. In my free time, I volunteer at MANA and as an assistant coach for the Methacton School District. My work history includes being a custodian at North Penn School District and salesperson at Rally House. I also did an internship with the Eagles. I do want to thank you for the opportunity to interview and apologize if seemed nervous. If I seem nervous. As an individual with autism, it takes a little bit more thought to work through the interview process.
Hi, I'm Liam, and this is my story.
When I was little, my mom noticed that there was something not typical about me. I spent many years trying different kinds of therapy and diets and seeing many kinds of specialists. Eventually, I was diagnosed as being on the autism spectrum. But there were lots of things about my childhood that were typical, too. I played with my sister when we were little. I learned to play guitar and percussion instruments, sang in the choir, and acted in many productions. I loved sports and played baseball, basketball, and my favorite sport of all, football. When I went to high school, my dad talked to the coach about me being on the football team. It's often difficult for people with autism to make friends and be included. But the high school football team included me, and I joined the team. Through my mom's job and her networking, the Philadelphia Eagles heard about my story. They decided to make a video called The Road to Victory, Liam McClure. The video went viral. Lots of crazy things happened after that. Everywhere I went around my hometown, people recognized me. Through my mom's job, I was invited to throw out the first pitch at a Phillies game. I got to meet some Philadelphia Flyers, got to interview Jordan Matthews, and got to introduce Eagles head coach Doug Peterson at an Eagles Charitable Foundation event. Now I'm transitioning to adulthood. Things are different now than when I was a kid, but there are still lots of challenges, like when my dogs act up, or when I tried to interview for a job.
When did you find out you had your interview?
I just got an email from the manager of Duck Donuts this morning.
Oh wow, that happened fast.
She wanted me there at 4 to 6 p.m. tomorrow. According to Ann Rowe of the A.J. Drexel Autism Institute, when a person with autism transitions to adulthood, it's like falling off a cliff. Most autism support services are provided through school. Services are expensive and hard to get as an adult.
Zach Ertz out wide, one-on-one.
Clement flares out to the right, caught over the middle and into the end zone. Zach Ertz for the touchdown.
I didn't really know what they were looking at the time. To me, it seemed pretty obvious, but when they were reviewing it for that long, I mean, that's when doubt seeps in just a little bit.
Giving up wasn't going to be the thing that I'd do. I just gotta work hard and get more energy, never give up, never stop, never back down, and never lose faith.
The Methacton Warriors line up at their own 35, moving from our right to our left. Jason Ekman under center. Ekman takes the snap. He's back. He pumps. He's going deep. He's got McClure at the 40, at the 30, at the 20. Liam McClure, touchdown! Touchdown, Methacton Warriors!
I am fortunate to have help as I take community college classes part-time. I hope to go on to a regular college. I was able to get an internship with the Eagles this past summer, editing photos of training camp. Others helped me organize this video and write the script, but I did all the editing myself. Someday I'd like to work in sports broadcasting. Until then, I'll keep interviewing for other part-time jobs to get more experience.
And that's all there is to it.
So there's Liam. Liam is doing quite well now. He's working in a grocery store in the region and still taking classes, still keeping up with some of his friends from high school. And again, but this is a lifelong struggle. This is trying to find that spot and maintain that spot. Requires a village and then some, all through this process. So we're going to see if we can kind of pick up the pace a little bit here, since we're getting 1 hour down. Whoops, there we go. So transition to adulthood. Obviously, we're talking about many dollars that are involved. That doesn't mean that we should kind of shy away from that. But as Liam was talking about, the dropping off that cliff is a pretty typical experience, and the costs of it, adults on the spectrum, if we were to actually to provide what is needed, these are the increasing rates up until almost the modern times that were estimated. If we were going to do it properly, the reality is that we're not meeting that need. We're still looking at underemployment or unemployment rates that are in the 80% range or thereabouts of many folks on the autism spectrum as adults. That doesn't mean that that there's no jobs available, but it means that they are underemployed or unemployed, oftentimes without the supports that they need to really truly enjoy their skills. So we do have, through neurodiversity consultants and folks, we do have mentors who do work with folks. Track 1 or level 1, level 2, level 3, kind of depending on what their needs are on the spectrum, with phases of training, apprenticeship, and employment. These are programs that are specially designed for each individual, but also that are done in collaboration with things like Office of Vocational Rehabilitation or school districts or what have you, to be able to, to foster that kind of engagement across systems. From a private consulting firm like Neurodiversity Consultants, many families aren't able to afford that kind of level of support, or maybe the district can, provide that level of support, or help supplement that level of support, to help the families create that transition to adulthood. But it is not a one size fits all. We need all kinds of options that are out there. Placements and resources, traditional ones, CRRs, CLAs, outpatient service residential settings, individual aids, all these things start to disappear as time goes on. And it becomes a more and more difficult situation as we go through. Susan Epstein and her daughter are referenced here. Talking about, we're not going to go through the whole thing, but talking about kind of the falling off the cliff piece that happens that Liam described. So what do we need to do next? We're talking about building our own Silicon Valley, not necessarily, based on computers, but what are those little things that, can maximize the strengths? What can individuals do? How can we get groups of individuals together and be able to engage them to do what they can do for the group, what the group can be successful in? We have other families who are joining together to try to find their own safe havens, try to create their own small communities, because one size doesn't fit all. It's not that we can just send all our kids to Silicon Valley and expect that they're just, going to, be successful out there. We have to be able to do this in our own communities. Here in the Germantown section of Philadelphia, there's a group called Families Can. In Bryn Mawr, there's JHI, or Judith Creed Horizons for Adult Independence. In Narberth, Pennsylvania, there's JEVS, which runs a program called PIN, which is Personal Improvement Network. With folks living in the community but coming together to work on things like daily living skills and financial independence and education, grading certifications, how to do a job search. These are the small communities that are starting to thrive around this region to be able to meet those needs. Companies are starting to recognize that carving out spots for their autistic employees, it's not just about doing something charitable. This is about what's good for business. Walgreens, for instance, I think that has one L in it. Anyway, was one of the companies that designed an entire distribution center, for folks with disabilities, and I think it was North Carolina or South Carolina. Turns out that distribution center is the most productive distribution center that they have. Gennardi's, who has a long-standing history of supporting folks in the spectrum, giving them opportunities. Specialistern, working on, or Spiritech, both of which are tech companies that have specialized kind of placements that allow folks on the autism spectrum to be highlighted because of their strengths, not in spite of their differences. And places, the Autism at Work programs, there's a joint effort started at SAP, third largest software company in the world, located over here in just outside of Philadelphia. Ernst & Young jumped on there, Lockheed Martin, Microsoft, other organizations, Ford Motor Company, start to identify that finding folks through their autism diagnosis, allowing them to apply fully identified, bypasses the discomfort that many folks on the autism spectrum have in searching for a job, trying to find that, the dozens of applications that they need to send out there, not having necessarily a huge social network or vocational network to get their first opportunity, trying to find a way in the back door so that we can observe them in the moment doing jobs, doing things that they actually, are capable of doing, rather than putting them through a kind of arbitrary set of questions in a social situation with a HR representative who may or may not have any idea how they're actually going to function in the job. Freddie Mac, other financial institutions that have identified that, autistic folks, a lot of them are exceptionally, bright in mathematics and checking for errors and making sure that spreadsheets are a certain way. These are some of just a small sampling of the types of skills that many folks in the autistic spectrum are capable of, but don't necessarily have the opportunity to enjoy. And this is where we, find ourselves in a real pickle as far as finding or reducing the underemployment rate across the country. I wanted to mention job coaching versus job carving. Job coaching implies that somebody will be able to get maybe a competitive job, maybe a job that's augmented by some funding, and be coached into that job. In other words, to fit the square peg into a round hole, if you will, versus job carving, which is kind of what the Spiritech and Specialist and other companies, Autism to Work, are trying to address by filling a hole versus finding a need. This is a matter of finding partner employers. Sometimes folks that are in the community, sometimes executives that have family members on the spectrum, perhaps, and using those personal or professional connections to convince companies that it is in their best interest to not just hire because there's a quota for disabilities, folks to be hired with disabilities at the companies, but that in doing so and meeting those quotas, they can do so in a way that actually expands and enhances their business operations. That becomes the equation that we need to address. There are issues of possible exploitation as we're starting to bring autistic folks into the workforce. There is a sense of don't be a Nikola Tesla, don't be taken advantage of by Edison. That your ideas are taken and then you're thrown out the door later, or that you're not paid for the work that you're doing. These are concerns, and we need to be vigilant about fighting for the rights of autistic people. In neurodiversity consultants, many of our one-to-one mentors and our coaches are neurodiverse themselves. So one of the things that we try to stick with as much as possible is giving a really fair, really generous kind of hourly kind of reimbursement for the work that they do, even if they need a certain level of support, not to exploit those wages and to give them lower and lower amounts of money because maybe they are a little bit anxious when they first get on the job or what have you. It's our job to be able to get people to understand that matching their autistic family member or student or whoever it may be is actually better served by someone on the autism spectrum, perhaps, that can understand them in a way that other folks may not be able to understand them. That's a narrative that needs to be carried out across any employment opportunity. There are remaining obstacles also that continue to challenge the access to employment that folks on the autism spectrum have. Many folks on the autism spectrum have a history of being hospitalized or 302'd, involuntarily committed for maybe there's a behavioral and emotional difficulty that they had and they were brought in and against their will, essentially, to be able to be assessed, even if they made the call, maybe they just got a ride to the hospital from crisis services, and so there was considered a 302 or some kind of an involuntary commitment. Sometimes those prevent them from passing a criminal background check or a criminal a history. When companies go through that information and those pop up in records, all of a sudden now they're not considered for jobs anymore. These are the kinds of obstacles that may pop up apart from just going through the job search process that can derail us as time goes on. We need to be able to find ways to advocate. And there are folks who are starting to advocate for moving beyond that as well. We talked about a couple of these programs already, so I'm going to skip through as well. We talked about Phoenixville 5 a little bit. I'm going to see if we can fast forward a little bit to where are we? Okay, so part of this, part of what we try to do is offer what we call vocational skills workshops. This is a picture of Nate Deacher, self-advocate, who won the Tip of the Cap Award for his, advocacy, his mentoring of folks on the spectrum. He himself is on the spectrum, so what better person to, kind of play that role than, someone like Nate. He was pretty happy that he was with two 76ers cheerleaders up on the scoreboard, being recognized for his work with us, but go Nate. But the vocational skills workshops that we presented, the initial data suggests that we are having a very positive interaction. This is the first set of workshops that we did at Drexel University with students at Drexel University who identified on the autism spectrum, started to show decreases in their pre-post scores. Again, this is not a great research design. It is a pre-post, so there is some threats to validity there. But our initial kind of numbers suggest that yes, we are looking at some positive direction, even over the course of a set of 4-hour-long workshops where we're starting to give folks the vocational skills and the self-advocacy skills that they need to be able to compete for competitive jobs, but also to self-advocate for job carving in their own kind of circles. So we're happy with where we're going with that. There are also programs on campus, various campuses that we've helped support with direct autism support programs. So we've been training their graduate students to be able to deliver these courses in concert with their co-op experiences at Drexel. There are other universities that are also doing some amazing things, whether it's Lebanon Valley College, whether it's Marywood University, folks that universities that have kind of an outreach to autistic students, not just because they're meeting an ADA requirement, but because they're really seeing the value of students who are coming through. Landmark College in Vermont, Full Sail University in Florida. These are the places that tend to attract more folks in the spectrum and tend to have a culture of supporting and helping folks through those challenging times. I'm going to skip through some of the friendship algorithm. I'm sorry for folks that enjoy Big Bang Theory, but we'll see if we can save that for another time based on our kind of dwindling time here. We're going to get right into life circles. So the idea about vocational training and social skills training really starts to boil down to understanding where we are in the course of our own lives, in the concentric circles, if you will. For folks who are familiar with, I'm not going to go into a lot of the theoretical history, but for folks who are familiar with Urie Bronfenbrenner ecological systems theory, or Margaret Beale Spencer's PVES model, which is a little bit more of a complex version of ecological systems theory. They start to understand that the person is at the center, and then we have people that are circled around them, in each of life's domains. So the idea is that whether it's the social domain, whether it's romantic, whether it's familial, vocational, all of these angles, all these pieces of the cube, or the multi-sided dice, if you will, have their own life domain associated, and on each one of those faces is a new life domain. As people work through and this system, this idea of life circles, they start to identify how they can add up social capital, how they can gain social capital, vocational capital, romantic capital, recreational capital, even familial capital with people that can add up over time and bring folks closer and closer from the area of acquaintances down to your regular friends or your colleagues, down to your core, the people that are with you every day in that life domain, perhaps, that are supporting you and you're supportive of them. There is a kind of a systematic way that we start to look at this, and it can be helpful for a lot of folks to understand what that means. That outer circle being the acquaintances, middle circle being the friends. This is the social example of social circles, and the inner circle, kind of the daily folks that you connect with. Ideally, there's enough room for maybe 2 to 5 friends in the middle, ideally 6 to 10 friends in that mid-range, and then unlimited number in the acquaintances circle. So those are people that are kind of in the wings that you see occasionally that may kind of come in handy in bringing opportunities to that person. So just a way to illustrate that a little bit. As far as other life domains are concerned, we have acquaintances all the way down through the life domains: social, romantic, familial, vocational, educational, spiritual, and recreational. In the middle circle, these take different forms. So yes, you have friends in the social domain. We have in the romantic domain, we have possible dating partners, possible dates, people that you go on dates with. Doesn't mean that you're actively going on dates, they're just possible. In the family, we have extended family, we have vocational colleagues, we have educational classmates, we have spiritual congregations, we have recreational teams or groups. And then we have in the inner circle, core friends, romantic partners, nuclear family, co-workers, study buddies, committees that you work with at your place of worship if you have one, practice partners if you're into sports or gaming or what have you. So these are the people that that are making up those circles. And as we start to map these circles out, we start to fill in these holes, we start to understand that that these circles change and are flexible over time. At some point, the more that you connect with certain people, the more consistent you are, the less you have to worry about kind of maintaining them. They become lifelong connections or lifelong friends. So they kind of migrate to the center of that cube. They're solidified. They're not going anywhere. 500 to 1,000 social capital points or recreational capital or what have you kind of means that that person is always going to be there. Even if you're not maintaining them all the time, the idea of a lifelong connection is that they're always going to be there. Unless somebody really messes up and kind of alienates someone, then of course they may go on hiatus. Maybe you can get them back, maybe not. But you're always going to feel a connection there on some level. And it's okay for people to move out of the circles that you're trying to maintain, that you're trying to, work with. Maybe they come back someday, maybe they don't. That's okay. This is the nature of circles. It's a two-way kind of decision, whether someone comes closer to you, whether someone moves further away from you. This is something that is fluid, something that changes over time. You have partial control, but you don't have full control. That other person has just as much control of that interaction as you may. And that's okay, because there are other options that are out there that we can investigate, that we can seek out, whether it's online, whether it's in person. There are options out there. Some of them may not be as appealing, but there are options out there. We can make changes in those circles. So identifying one person at a time to focus on. So, say someone is written into this slot in the mid-range circle. We may want to identify moving them into the center. We may have somebody that's a core friend who we don't want to be part of that center circle anymore. We may want to move them out. We may have an acquaintance down here that we want to move into that mid-range kind of friend circle. We may want somebody to exit out of that mid-range friend circle. And so all these kind of interminglings back and forth occur. And when we start to map them out, then we can start to visually look at who we want to remain close to. We start to almost develop a list, a maintenance list of people that we want to connect with on a reasonably, daily, weekly, maybe even monthly basis, depending on which circle we want to maintain them in. The idea is that as we start to identify that person, we're going to brainstorm topics that might interest that person. We're going to choose topics that hold common interest first between you and that person, but ultimately that topic that we choose to engage that person on, or that activity, needs to be something that is of their interest at least. Hopefully our interest as well, but at least of their interest. The idea is that if we meet them on their terms, walk into their world, as Burt Rutenberg and of course Stanley Greenspan talked about, meeting the person where they are and walking them into the world, we're much more likely to earn social capital, to have the opportunity to connect with somebody, to have an opportunity to get a job, etc., if we meet them on their level. And that's a hard thing for many folks in the spectrum to do, is to put yourself into the shoes of another person, to use that theory of mind to try to figure out what is it that they want? How can I fit into their interest level? How do I kind of become or reflect what they want to see in another person so that I can be that person that they want to engage with? And then how do I fully embrace that person? How do I kind of assume that role, if you will? Once you identify the topics and so on, then we move into what's called 3x3 conversation. First, we need to find where that person is. So again, this is a real life kind of example, but again, similar kinds of arrangements can be found online as well. The idea is that as we start to identify the topics that we're going to bring with us into a situation or a place, then we start to, kind of look at social shapes. So the idea is, say you're this person, you're walking into this room, and you see people arranged all over the place. Maybe it's it's at a gaming store and it's getting ready for a Magic the Gathering draft night. And these are people that are mingling around. And you're trying to figure out, well, this is kind of awkward. Where do I go to speak? Looking for closed and open shapes in that environment. If you look at, this kind of like little triangle of people here, this is a closed shape. Everyone is kind of facing in toward the center. And you're walking around and you're trying to figure out where to go. You're probably not going to be able to fit in here because this is a closed shape. You walk over, you take a look at this direction. You see two people kind of squared up shoulders on, and they're looking straight at each other, and they're talking with each other. Also an example of a closed shape. So that's a straight line, if you will. We look at, this group over here. Well, this is a possibility. There's 3 people, but they're not completely facing toward the center. They're a little bit open. So walking over toward this direction and inserting yourself right about here could be an effective place to start. Another option is right over here. So there are 2 people that are talking to each other, but they're open to someone sliding in here, just nice and slowly. There's a person by themselves over here in the corner. If they're facing outward and not looking at their phone or what have you, they're making a little bit of eye contact, maybe sliding over there is an option. As you slide over into that arrangement, you'll start to make a little bit of eye contact, visually. You'll start to listen for what they're talking about. You'll start to determine how it is that you could, engage in this group. And you're going to be picking up the social kind of cues that are visual, as far as, are they looking in your direction? So they have to make eye contact. Are they looking in your direction enough so that it's okay for you to approach? And then as you're observing the approach, you may watch and listen and join in what they're able to talk about, or you may engage in a topic that is relevant for that particular place. Say you're going into a gaming store and it's Magic the Gathering draft night. You're going to say this is your first time in the store. You may go up to this, if they're not already engaged in a conversation, say, what kind of decks are you guys building? Or have you built? And start to strike up a conversation about MTG. Maybe there's another conversation topic that you might bring this relevant to to that place. Maybe there's Warhammer things on the shelf. Maybe you say, you guys play Warhammer here sometimes. Who knows? There's all kinds of things that you can throw in there. Once in the group, you're going to pick up those nonverbal signs that the shape is shifting. You can help shift that shape yourself by turning your shoulders and opening it up to other people. Or you can kind of get the hint from other folks. You're always going to walk into that situation with a couple things prepared, though. You're going to have a reason for beginning the conversation. In other words, a safe topic that you're going to be engaging in. You're going to have a reason for ending that conversation. In other words, your exit strategy. It's time to get back to work, or it's time to get ready for the game, or maybe I should go get a drink, or maybe I'm going to go check on my my text before we start. You're going to have a way that that easily exits you from that conversation so that you can do so smoothly. You're going to have 3, if you know the people that you're going to be engaging with, you're going to establish 3 topics. So there's a global topic that you may talk about that's, anybody can talk about, such as movies, weather, sports, regional events, etc. The local topic, what's happening around you, what that event is actually about. That will be a topic that's easiest to engage in. And if you know the person well, you're going to have something personal that you're going to be able to ask them about. Maybe, how's your sister doing, or what's going on with your rock collection, or whatever it may be. So we're going to start with a local question. Usually, if you get responsiveness, great. You can ask a personal question. If there's not responsiveness, then you can go global. But again, not too global, not too personal. Keep it kind of in that mid-range of what is expected as far as in that setting. Conversation matrix. The way that most conversations go, if you were to boil them down, has a bit of a pattern to it. And you can identify this pattern, you can follow this pattern as a little bit of a guide for yourself. We call this the 3x3 matrix: question, listen, share, question, listen, share, question, listen, share. So 3x3, QLS, QLS, QLS. You're going to have a topic that you're going to engage, as we just discussed. You're going to ask a question about that topic. You're going to then listen carefully to what that response is. After you listen carefully, you're going to pick something from what that person just said, and you're going to share a relevant piece of information about yourself. So you're not just asking questions. You're not just plain listening. You're not just sharing all about yourself. You're shifting from question to listening to sharing. Question, listen, share, all related to each other. If at some point that person asks a question in return, then you shift right down into what we call a 50-50 conversation. So is there a question in return? Yes, 50-50 conversation. That's a little bit more of a fluid form of communication. It doesn't have to be structured like the 3x3 introduction to the conversation. that 50-50 communication happens, or conversation happens, when people share ideas back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, until either that conversation becomes lopsided. So either one person is doing all the talking, or whether that conversation is exhausted, there's nothing else to say about that conversation, at which point you have the opportunity to restart the matrix at the top, asking another, finding another topic and asking another question. Or you can say, well, I should probably give my reason for ending. Time for me to, get back to whatever it is. And if there's no response, see you later. Now, if you get all the way down to your last share on the 3x3 matrix and it hasn't gone into 50-50 conversation yet, asking a question in return has not happened, then you can give your reason for ending. 3 strikes, 1, 2, 3, and you're out. That means you give the reason for ending, give them one more chance to say, well, I should probably go, or maybe it's time to do such and such. Then it gives them one more chance to ask you a question in return, or maybe restart with another kind of topic altogether, and then see you later. So this is the nature of it. I'm going to skip through a few of these because I know we're getting a little, we want to keep up this pace. You can kind of keep track of how successful you are through this conversation. So the way that you score social capital or vocational capital is that as you're having that conversation, if you make it through the full 3x3, regardless if somebody actually asks a question in return or not, give yourself a point. Okay, it's just a bonus point. You made it through. You didn't get a lot of responsiveness, but at least you made it through the 3x3 conversation. You asked 3 relevant questions. You listened to the 3 answers. You shared a little bit about yourself 3 times, and then you got out of there after 3 strikes. Great. If they do ask a question in return, give yourself 2 points. Okay. So as soon as that happens, they ask a question in return. You don't necessarily have to go into the 50-50 conversation, but give yourself 2 points. If you do go into the 50-50 conversation, and you're able to follow that through and to have a comfortable conversation, and then to end that conversation with a reason for ending, give yourself 3 points. Most conversations, that's a pretty good score right there. If you can get 3 points out of a conversation, doing very well. 4 points, even better. Multiple 50-50 conversations usually engages, multiple different angles of a conversation, perhaps a couple different topics or angles of the same topic. 5 points is a recognition at the end of all that we should talk again, or when should we get together? A recognition that you just scored a lot of social capital points, enough so that people want to come back for more someday, or you recognize that and they agree that they'd like to talk again sometime. Maybe there's an exchange of information, maybe not. Maybe it's just an acknowledgement that we should talk again. But those are the things that you want to shoot for. As we said, as you start to score social capital, you can kind of take a look back at the social circles. You start to say, okay, well, I had a successful conversation. You can even create almost like a bank account, if you will, of capital being monetary, but in this case, social or vocational or what have you, or educational, that each person that is on your maintenance kind of schedule, your list here of folks that you're maintaining on a daily or a weekly or maybe a monthly-ish kind of basis, each one of those folks will have a certain bank account associated with how many social capital points you've earned, not just that week, but cumulatively. And as those points increase higher and higher and higher, you find yourself getting closer and closer to that person, or more consistently close to that person. They become your core, part of your core eventually, if it's a daily thing. If not, that's okay too. But eventually they turn into a lifelong connection. Once you get about 500-ish social capital points, it takes time. It takes time for all that to happen. At first, you're not going to have a lot of trust in people, or they may not have a lot of trust in you. This forms over time. Is a foundation for social connection. Trust is that two-way street. It's not absolute. Okay. If you start people around 50%, you may trust them, you may not. Probably a good place to start. If it shows, if your conversations with them go well, you feel like they're listening to you, you feel like they're being trustworthy, in other words, telling the truth about things, following through on their commitments to you, then that trust starts to go up. And you can track each person, not just on social capital, but on the level of trust that you have with them. if you have a high degree of trust, you may want them to become closer. If not, then you can, say no, thank you, or just, kind of not, pay as much attention to them and drift away, from their social circle and in turn your social circles. But it's, that's up to you. It's not up to them necessarily to determine, how much you trust them or how much that you should trust them. This is your own determination. Sometimes, having a wing person to, go through this is very helpful. That you're not sure who to trust, you can always help, ask for help with other folks. Some of our folks on the spectrum aren't able to manage the social circles or the life circles as efficiently as other folks. Sometimes they need some help from technology, and that's perfectly acceptable. That does limit the number of people that are willing to necessarily engage in real life. It does take more time with assistive technology to communicate, but online, sometimes it can actually be an advantage in some ways. So this is a scene from Wretches and Jabberers of folks who are communicating. I'm not going to play all the clips, but this is a scene. I think this is the sidewalk scene where folks are fully engaged, but none of them are verbal. Just another way to look at communication and friendship development. And each one of the folks in the Wretches and Jabberers movie has somebody who tends to help them with that communication, but these are all independently communicating people, passing around the different devices around the table, getting ready for a conference the next day where they're presenting.
The jabberers, he talks about that others are the jabberers who are able to speak. Yeah, we poor wretches are better than jabberers.
Yeah.
They don't know it yet, but we will tell it to them on Saturday. Is that okay?
On Saturday, meeting at the conference?
Conference, yes.
No.
For folks that can't read that, my new partner in crime, my fellow wretch in arms, he's speaking back and forth. He says, listen, you tell my story to the world. And Tracy, I have a lot to learn from you. So this is communication happening.
Larry is a jabberbox.
Oops, sorry.
A pretty good wretch. Okay with you? So Larry. Oh!
So sometimes communication takes a little bit more effort.
Now look what you did, Pascal.
Larry considers himself a jabberer. There we go. So again, the nature of what friendships should look like isn't necessarily what we see in sitcoms. This isn't necessarily an episode of Friends, although it is in some ways even more endearing and loving than kind of our usual examples of what friendships should look like. We need to expand that kind of version. There are various kind of obstacles in the way. We talk about relaxation, social anxiety, your whole kind of bucket of social juice, if you will, that neurotypicals have. Neurodiverse folks, not necessarily the same kind of full bucket of social juice that they have to use. Sometimes we need to do this in little bits at a time. Jumping in and managing, an entire, social circle full of, of 4 or 5 core folks or 10, regular friends isn't going to happen. Focusing on 1 or 2 folks, may be perfectly sufficient. So I don't want people to get the idea that they have to fill in all those notches or all those blanks in your social circles. Understanding how to work through that relaxation, very important. I'm going to just kind of skip through here a little bit. These are just techniques that allow you to be a little bit more. Actually, this is a good one. Folks often talk about learning social interactions by being an observer. Many folks on the autism spectrum tend to be excellent social observers because they're forced to be social observers. In other words, they're oftentimes experiencing from an early age, looking at social interactions from the outside in, what they call the tertiary observation perspective. In other words, looking at it as if it's on camera. And this is akin to Jane Goodall, observing, the apes and how the apes interact. And eventually you start to learn the patterns. You start to understand that there's a, and this is by Irene McHenry and Carol Moog, who are great, wonderful colleagues in the region here, from the Autism Playbook for Teens. The idea of being an observer, like Jane Goodall, looking at the apes, that is an experience that many folks on the spectrum, talk about. And it's not until they get to be teens or even adults that we start to identify how it is that humans interact with each other and how it is that we can start to imitate or mimic some of that behavior, that social behavior. Sometimes for some folks, they aren't comfortable imitating. They just want to be themselves. They want to be in their own zone. That's perfectly respectable, but it does have certain shortcomings. Being able to code switch back and forth between a neurodiverse and a neurotypical kind of orientation to the world is a tool. It's a skill. It's something that develops over time. It isn't essential. It isn't required in life to be able to make friends or to have colleagues or what have you, but it makes the opportunities in life much more plentiful and viable when you're able to code switch back and forth between those kind of codes, just like Jane Goodall eventually was able to do, at least partially. She was never fully accepted as one of the apes, if you will, but she was partially accepted. She was understood enough to be in that space. And sometimes being in that space with folks is perfectly acceptable. I was talking with somebody actually earlier today who feels that he never quite fully engages with his friends. He's, in his late 20s now. His friends have been his friends since he was a middle schooler. And so they've come to understand that he needs his own time away. So as they're engaging with their whether it's gaming or whatever it is, whatever activity they're doing, he may be over on the side, kind of, reading or doing his, Pokemon or whatever it is. And they understand that. They know that he needs that time and space. They'll invite him over whenever possible. There are times when he may, kind of use some of his social juice to engage with them on their level, to kind of code switching back and forth. And then he'll go in and spend his time on his own, and that's accepted by his friends. It's a lovely kind of embracing way for neurotypicals and neurodiverse folks to engage in the world. Doesn't always happen, but when it does, it's a lovely thing to see. I guess we can talk about the tips and tricks. So encouraging self-advocates to access supports under ADA. And this is Americans with Disabilities Act, not only on college campuses, but also their employers. A lot of folks ask, how is it that I'm supposed to engage with my employer? When is it that I'm supposed to identify? It's a really hard question to answer. What happens with many folks on the spectrum is that they don't identify necessarily as autistic to their employer. And then when, say, they're having trouble interacting with customers, or they get overwhelmed with a situation, or they start to make strange noises and make their coworkers kind of nervous, there's no recourse. There's no disclosure that's happened to an employer that allows that employer to stand up for their ADA rights. I've talked with human resource directors who tell me that, if only that employee had come to them and said, I'm on the autism spectrum, they could have created a plan, an accommodation for them, or even, not necessarily outing that person with their identification, although, certainly they can out themselves if they choose. But they can create trainings for other folks to get them to become aware that there are certain needs of some employees who are on the spectrum that may be different from your neurotypical employees. Accessing the ADA supports and self-disclosing your own diagnosis or your disability, to your employer protects your employer. It allows them to meet certain regulations under the U.S. Department of Labor. When they come to check to see if there's 7% of the working population identified with disabilities, but it also allows them to be more accommodating and resilient to folks with other disabilities, whether it's autism, whether it's any kind of disability. It creates a culture of inclusivity and accommodations that is going to help employ people, keep them employed, and eventually allow them to work through those job experiences and go on to what we call sustainable kind of employment at their professional and ability levels. This isn't just about keeping a minimum wage job. This is about identifying the extent to which people can be fully realized in their work life, in their dating life, even in their personal lives. All of those things start to line up as we make these inroads into our adulthood. Strengths-based, open-minded orientation. This is, yes, we all have our things that are going to hold us back, but what can we do? We talked about this earlier. Recognizing neurodiversity as a form of diversity, not necessarily just a disability, but also a form of diversity itself. That isn't necessarily recognized in kind of employee handbooks, but in my experience with some of the HR people that I've worked with, there is a consideration and sometimes an inclusion of neurodiversity in their own protocols and their policies with recognizing diversity. Professionals need to collaborate with self-advocates. Nothing about us without us. Being able to collaborate and recognize and encourage folks to self-disclose, to be open to the idea of self-disclosure, not necessarily identifying specific people, but to allow, as a teacher or as a coworker or what have you, those people who identify as self-advocates to be fully welcomed into that environment. Parents need to support, but allow children the opportunity to fail. And this is speaking to the parents that are on tonight. It's absolutely essential that we support folks. This is not my child turns 18 or 21 and they're just necessarily going to be fully independent. It's just doesn't work like that. It doesn't work with any young adult like that. This is a gradual kind of entry into the world. At the same time, that doesn't mean that we don't give the opportunity to fail. Sam Huber, one of my favorite self-advocates, worked with Sam for years. He was presenting at a conference that I was running a few years ago, and he titled his seminar, "Cut That Cord." As a self-advocate, he felt that that's what his mother needed to do for him. Doesn't mean that that's the case for everybody, but he needed to be cut off from the support that, not fully cut off, but from his perspective, he'd be cut off from that family support in order to realize his potential. And that was his story. We actually ended up changing the name of it because I thought that was a little bit on point, for the title of his seminar. But Sam is kind of proof of the fact that if you're able to kind of make those mistakes and fail a few times, and Sam did fail as an advocate, as an employee, as a person who was trying to find love and so on. He failed many times. But he kept on working, kept on trying, he kept on accessing his supports, asking for help where he needed it. And now he's married with another child on the way and holding down a steady job and being really happy with his life. Now, that storybook ending, it's not necessarily a storybook, it's always a challenge. But that kind of ending isn't what all of our self-advocates are able to enjoy, but it is what we shoot for. It's what we aspire to. These are the role models in our community that we can look to and say, this is what I want to pursue. We're going to be on the path toward that. Doesn't mean that that's an end point. So encouraging the folks to keep those doors open for individuals as neurodiverse, encourage people to know their rights, stand up for your rights, stand up for folks who don't have the ability to stand up for their own rights, and hopefully we're writing a better path forward for all of our young folks, not just folks on the spectrum, but the entire community of neurodiverse folks that identifies differently, that wants to get out there and make a solid difference in the world. So I know I said we'd leave about 15 minutes for questions and comments and so on, and I think we're just about at that point. I think I've talked probably everybody's ear off and ready to kind of hear anything else that people would like to hear about. So.
Well, I want to say before questions get going, thank you, because that was fantastic information there. A lot of information, but it was all very well presented.
Thank you very much. All right.
So if you guys want to unmute or use the chat box for any questions, feel free to go ahead and just ask them, or if you want me to read them off, that's fine too. You can put it in the chat box.
Hi, everybody. I guess I will unmute myself first. I guess first off, I want to say, Lakin, thank you so much, like always, for doing these. It was definitely something that I'm glad that I got the reminder email and was able to attend, because it was a lot of information that helps myself and my husband, Adam, with our son and our other children. And Dr. Mitchell, thank you so much as well for all of the information. It was a lot that I did not know, especially about the adult. My son's only 11, but that's always something that's in the back of my mind, is what would happen to him as he gets older, and the things that he needs, and how easy is it to get the services or different aspects that he would have to look forward to transitioning into adult. So you gave me a lot of information, a lot of videos that made me tear up, but it was good information, and it was moments of proud that these people have that. So I appreciate that. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Yeah. And you said your son is 11 years old, is that right?
Yes, my
Gotcha.
I have 3 children. My youngest is 11. He was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder 2 years ago. And I have a 13-year-old who was diagnosed when he was about 24 months old, well, around 24 months old, with autism. Back then it was PDD. But he has kind of went in the opposite direction, and he's now in middle school in 8th grade, and he's in the gifted program, has been for a couple years. So he is completely opposite from my 11-year-old as far as what their autism looks like. So it's good to have a lot more different views. And I always love when people say that it's not the same for everybody, because it definitely is not. And people like to put a label on children with autism and what their staple is supposed to look like, but it is definitely not the same. My kids could not be any more opposite.
Absolutely. And this is, you meet one person on the autism spectrum, you meet one person on the autism spectrum. This is, this is the nature of the world that we live in. A chromosome here, a chromosome there makes a huge difference in how people develop, and also the environment that they develop in. But the number one, factor that determines the prognosis and how much progress we will make, is the active involvement of parents and the systems that they're able to draw in. That's why it's so wonderful to see kind of, the folks at the ARC and the folks, in the autism community or the disabilities community, kind of working hand in hand. We need to be able to build those bridges. I worked with a family years ago who actually still have their a poster up on my wall with their information that they put out. The oldest son was on the autism spectrum, then came a neurotypical son, and then a son with Downs, a son with Fragile X followed after that. So I don't know what the odds are of having 4 completely neurologically different children. But of course, the one that needed the most support was the neurotypical one. And so that's the one who I worked with. So it's an entire kind of, it's an entire community that has to come together. So I really appreciate that. Other questions, comments before we end up tonight?
Yes, hello. I just wanted to say thank you for sharing your knowledge with us and everything about this field. And I truly, truly appreciate your take on this subject, which has been overwhelmingly positive. It's very refreshing to hear from someone with your, from a professional standpoint and your clinical background, to kind of steer away from like the biomedical diagnosis model and kind of dive into like identity and affirmation. And that's very uplifting as a mother. And I know it would be for other mothers like myself, or families who have individuals who require high supports. We're often confronted with a lot of negativity and apprehension and just general ways to, change and therapies. And I was wondering if you, with that being said, if you have any specific go-to resources or programs or organizations that kind of share your perspective and kind of spread that more positive and affirmative action, and just helping with transitioning, for those who do experience a lot of like the behaviors and the negativity that's typically associated with it, but have that more reassuring and positive support.
Yeah, I appreciate that comment, and I think just as a preface to the resources is just understand that I'm not in a position to choose sides per se. I know that there are folks that like to kind of set up camp and say, okay, well, we need to look at this as a diagnosis, or this is an epidemic, or it's something that we need to cure, or the defeat autism now kind of mentality, or the old bill that was the Combating Autism Act, which is an unfortunate name for a wonderful kind of set of funding at the federal level that supported so many folks. I don't mean to dismiss those folks that kind of are coming more from that kind of deficit-based mentality. I think it's important to recognize deficits, but I also think that simultaneously we have to bring that conversation together with a strengths-based kind of an orientation. Years ago, Peter Gerhardt, who's wonderful colleague, talked about if he sees for a high school student shoe tying on another IEP, he's going to puke on it. And the idea that what is it that we need to be functional in the world? Do we need to tie shoes, or do we actually need to have a livelihood that can sustain us? I don't want to see another shoe tying kind of hours spent. I want to see somebody that's actually getting hands-on experience to do something in the world that's meaningful. So that's kind of strengths-based mentality. It's not what we can't do; it's what we can do. As far as resources are concerned, there's always the kind of the seminal kind of Temple Grandin materials that that we can turn to, Thinking in Pictures, or some of the old kind of classics. The Temple Grandin movie, I think, is a great one for folks that have HBO or can stream it from another source. Is a wonderful kind of synopsis of kind of a woman kind of coming into her own. Her mother, Eustacia Cutler, kind of her perspective on that. I'll save that for another day, but she writes a thorn in my pocket, and the thorn in my pocket that Temple's mother talks about is not the thorn of Temple. It is the thorn of the systems that tried to get her to institutionalize Temple, that tried to keep her back as a mother supporting her child. That was the thorn in her pocket. And so, my friendship over the years with Eustacia and with Temple, it's that speaks volumes. That it's not about the difficulties that our children or that our young adults on the spectrum are giving us as parents. It's about how we navigate those systems that's most important. For folks who are, for folks who are parents or neurodiverse folks, I would recommend, of course, Neurotribes by Steve Silberman, who also happens to be a Grateful Dead historian, so I like him on that side too. But Steve talks about, Neurotribes was a best-selling book several years ago. I think still relevant today. Raising Cubby for parents. If you know John Elder Robeson, that talks about his path in raising his own son on the spectrum and self-identifying as a father himself on the spectrum. Incredibly powerful kind of story. And is still relevant years later. So, and also as far as organizations, Autism Self-Advocacy Network for neurodiverse self-advocates hugely powerful. Julie Bascom is now heading up the organization. If you can catch Julie's stuff on YouTube, or her presentation at Drexel, that was I guess maybe last year. I guess it was delayed and was eventually done online because of the pandemic. She picked up where, of course, Arian Amon and Scott Robertson left off. So Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, I think it's autisticadvocacy.org, autistic advocacy, all one word, .org. They have a wonderful PDF that's phenomenal for self-advocates as well as parents who are recently diagnosed, called Welcome to the Autism Community. So if you search for the PDF, Welcome to the Autism Community, ASAN, they put it together with a couple of governmental organizations. It's more of a strengths-based, but also recognizing that there are some challenges that are going to be faced here. And there's no sugarcoating that for many folks on the spectrum. That PDF by itself is a nice place to start in that conversation. So.
No, thank you. I definitely agree that, the deficits need to be recognized, and that's how we're making accommodations and, how we're finding solutions and alternatives. But at the same time, I think parents really are finding what we're coming to find is just like a lack of positive resources to lean on. And also big Steve Silverman fan, just to say. Thank you.
Very nice. My pleasure. Any other folks tonight?
I don't have a question, but I do have a comment. I want to thank you, Dr. Mitchell, for mentioning transition services. I'm an advocate at the Arc of Lehigh, Northampton County, and I get so tired at IEP meetings that they want to pigeonhole these kids with disabilities, not just with autism, all disabilities. And they say, well, we have these, this is what we have for you to go as a job. You can go to a supermarket, you can go clean, you can go here. And I always say, but what about what they want to do? So thank you for talking about job carving. But unfortunately, our system in this state, they still want to pigeonhole these children into these particular jobs, and I always say, they say, well, they got to work on soft skills. And I'm like, oh my God, like you said about shoe tying, that word soft skills drives me crazy. Because what 18-year-old that graduates neurotypical has soft skills? Tell me that.
Yeah.
I know so I just want to thank you. You hit job carving. I really like that word, and I'm going to use it. And I'll keep advocating to not put these kids in these little boxes, the best I can. But thank you to the C-Park. This is great.
Thank you.
And I may definitely bring in your information back to our chapter, and we'd love for you to present for us too down the road. Absolutely. Great information. Great. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Yeah, thank you for joining tonight.
All right.
And just to let folks know, so neurodiversity consultants, if folks are interested in connecting in some way, I think you have the email down there, info@neurodiversityconsultants.com. If you have other questions and you'd like to contact me directly, you feel free to do that.
All righty. So I don't see any questions coming in. All right, so I did just want to say I'll stop the recording here soon to announce the winners, but I did want to throw out for October our upcoming sessions. Our other special ed advocate is setting up a session, and it's actually going to have two authors come, and they're going to talk about their books. I actually have them here. It's Choices by J.M. Crawford. You've seen that one. And then the other author that's going to be doing the session with her is A Life Suspended, and it's Nicole Donovan. And it's about, they both are moms with, I think they both have sons that are on the spectrum, and it's kind of their take of their life and stuff. So we are having both those authors come and just do a little session on it. And then also, I don't have the date quite yet, but we will be sending out stuff. And our director, Holly Turner, will be doing a session on adult service systems and what that all looks like once those kids get to the end of high school and that cliff there, and how the systems are set up, and what parents can expect when their child do transition eventually. So that one's always a great one for information. Like I said, we'll be sending out that on the group mail and posting it on our parent group and our site. So just look for those details. Here's coming soon. All right, let me go ahead and stop my recording.